Have you ever wondered how human beings could close their eyes and surrender to sleep when the air itself feels too thin to hold, when cold seeps through stone walls like water through cloth, when every breath requires conscious effort? How did families rest, generation after generation, in a place where the very act of sleeping becomes a form of endurance? Tonight, we drift toward the high Himalayas, to a time before Everest became a name known worldwide, before expeditions and fame transformed the mountain into something other than home. We're going to spend these quiet hours exploring how the Sherpa people, farmers, herders, traders, families, learned to sleep in conditions that would seem impossible to most of us, at altitudes where the air holds only half the oxygen of sea level, where winter nights stretch long and bitter and unforgiving. Before we step into this hushed journey through the thin, frozen nights of the world's highest inhabited places, I'd like to ask a small favor. If you'd tap the like button and subscribe to Epic Boring History, you'll join us for more of these late-night explorations into forgotten corners of the past. Leave a comment below. Let me know where you are right now, what time it is in your part of the world. Some of you might be wrapped in the deep quiet of midnight, others just beginning your day, and some somewhere in that liminal space between. Now perhaps dim your lights, maybe turn on a gentle fan for that soft background hum. Let's settle in together for tonight's drift through history. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a small stone village somewhere between 11 and 14,000 feet above the sea. The year might be 1880 or perhaps 1920. The exact date matters less than the rhythm of life, which has changed little across these particular centuries. The mountains rise around you like the walls of the world itself, their peaks lost in darkness and cloud. Below, valleys drop away into shadow, and above, stars multiply in the thin atmosphere until the sky seems more light than darkness. This is the Khumbu region, though it could be any of several valleys where Sherpa communities have made their homes for generations. The wind never truly stops here. It only varies between a steady pressure and a howling force that makes conversation impossible. You can feel it now, can't you? That subtle lightness in your chest, that faint breathlessness that comes simply from existing at this altitude. Your body is already working harder than it realizes, your heart beating a little faster, your lungs pulling a little deeper, trying to extract enough oxygen from air that feels somehow less substantial than the air you know. The village houses cluster together as if seeking mutual protection from the elements, their stone walls thick and low, their roofs weighted with rocks to keep them from being torn away by winter gales. Smoke rises from a few of them, barely visible against the darkening sky, carrying the smell of burning yak-dung, the primary fuel in a landscape where trees are scarce and precious. This is where we'll spend our time tonight, moving slowly through the experience of sleep in this impossible place. We'll feel what it meant to be an ordinary person facing an ordinary night in a landscape that makes ordinary survival extraordinary. Later, we'll follow the quiet youth of one particular person who carried these nights with him into history. We'll explore the mysteries and meanings that surrounded sleep in this culture, and we'll see how some lived with slightly more warmth than others, though no one truly escaped the mountain's cold democracy. But first, let us begin with the simple, difficult, endlessly repeated experience of trying to rest when the world itself seems inhospitable to rest. The sun is beginning its descent behind the western peaks now, and you know what this means. In the mountains at this altitude, darkness doesn't creep, it falls, and when it falls, the temperature plummets with it. You are standing outside your family's home, a structure your grandfather helped build, and your father has maintained, stone by stone, through years of wind and weather. The walls are thick, nearly 2 feet of carefully stacked stone, the gaps filled with mud and smaller rocks, the whole thing holding together through communal effort and constant attention. The door is low, forcing even you to duck slightly as you enter. This isn't poor craftsmanship, it's deliberate design, keeping the openings small to prevent heat from escaping and wind from entering. Inside, the main room serves every purpose: cooking, eating, working, gathering, and on the coldest nights, sleeping. The floor is packed earth, worn smooth by generations of feet, covered in places with woven mats made from yak hair, coarse, durable, smelling faintly of the animals who provided it. The hearth sits at the center, a depression lined with stones blackened by years of fires. Above it, the ceiling is equally black, coated with layers of soot that have accumulated season after season, a thick residue that actually serves as insulation, sealing tiny cracks and helping trap whatever warmth the fire provides. Your mother is preparing the evening meal, the last one before the long night ahead. The fire glows with chunks of dried yak-dung, which burns slowly, producing more smoke than heat, but it's the only fuel abundant enough to sustain you through winter. The smoke has nowhere to go except up through the stones of the roof and out through gaps that can't be sealed. It hangs in layers throughout the room, and you've learned to stay low when the smoke gets thick, to breathe the slightly clearer air near the floor. Your eyes water sometimes, especially when the wind shifts and pushes the smoke back down. Your throat has adapted, but visitors from lower altitudes often cough continuously in homes like yours. This is simply the exchange. Smoke irritates, but smoke also means warmth, and warmth means survival. You don't question it any more than you question the need to breathe. The meal tonight is simple. The meal most nights is simple. Tsampa, roasted barley flour mixed with butter tea, forming a thick paste that you shape with your fingers and eat in small portions. The tea itself is salty, made with butter churned from yak milk, and it serves as much to hydrate as to nourish. At this altitude, in this dryness, your body loses moisture with every breath, and the butter tea replaces what the mountain steals. There might be some dried meat if the season has been good, or a thin soup with potatoes and radishes grown in the struggling gardens that cling to the hillside terraces. But tonight is ordinary, so tonight is tsampa and tea. You eat slowly, not from ceremony, but from necessity. At this altitude, digestion requires more effort, more oxygen, and eating too quickly can leave you feeling dizzy and sick. The conversation around the hearth is quiet. Your father mentions the yaks. Your younger brother talks about a section of wall that needs repair before the next storm. Your mother wonders aloud about the barley stores and whether they'll last until spring. These are the concerns that repeat themselves day after day, season after season: survival, maintenance, endurance. As the meal ends and the wooden bowls are set aside, the fire is fed one more time. Your father places several rounded stones at the edge of the coals, letting them absorb heat slowly while the family finishes their evening tasks. Outside, full darkness has arrived, and with it, a cold that is difficult to describe to anyone who hasn't felt it. It's not simply uncomfortable, it's aggressive, seeking out any exposed skin, any gap in clothing, any moment of inattention. The temperature has likely dropped to -20°C already, and it will fall further as the night deepens. In the heart of winter, it can reach -40 or below, a cold that makes metal burn to touch and breath freeze into ice crystals on your beard or scarf. You step out briefly to check on the animals. The yaks are in their stone enclosure attached to the side of the house, their body heat actually contributing to the warmth of the human living space through the shared wall. They shift and breathe heavily in the darkness, their exhalations visible as great clouds of steam. Their thick coats protect them, but even they huddle together, instinctively understanding what you understand. Warmth is found in proximity. You can hear similar sounds from other households: the low sounds of animals settling, the creak of a door, someone's cough carrying across the cold air. The village at night is not silent, but it is quiet, a place where sound travels strangely in the thin atmosphere, sometimes clear across great distances, sometimes absorbed completely by the wind. Back inside, your family is preparing for sleep. This is not a quick process. It's a ritual of survival that everyone knows by heart. First, the sleeping area must be prepared. In your home, this is a raised platform built against the far wall, constructed from wooden planks laid across stone supports, lifted perhaps a foot off the ground to provide some insulation from the cold earth below. The platform is covered with more yak hair mats layered thick, and on top of these a collection of blankets that represent years of accumulated wealth. Most are woven from yak wool, incredibly dense and heavy, scratchy against skin but capable of trapping body heat. A few are made from sheep wool, slightly softer, reserved for the children and elders who need whatever small comfort can be spared. One, the most precious, has goat wool woven into its pattern, a gift from a relative who trades across the Tibetan border. The heated stones are carefully wrapped in cloth and placed near where feet will rest. They won't stay warm for long, perhaps an hour or two, but those hours make the difference between sleep and shivering wakefulness. You begin to layer yourself for the night. This is crucial. You don't undress for sleep, you add to what you're already wearing. Over your day clothes, you pull on an additional wool underlayer worn soft from use. Then a felt vest, then another wool robe, belted tight to trap air between the layers. Your feet, already in wool socks hand-knitted by your grandmother, slip into felt boots that will stay on throughout the night. Your hands receive the same treatment, thin wool gloves first, then heavier mittens made from sheepskin. Even your head will be wrapped, a wool cap pulled low over your ears. And if the night is particularly bitter, a scarf wound around to cover everything but your eyes. Some nights you'll breathe through the scarf, warming the air slightly before it enters your lungs. The family gathers on the sleeping platform, arranging themselves with practiced efficiency. The youngest children sleep in the middle, surrounded by older bodies, while the parents take the outer positions where the cold will strike first. You'll sleep pressed against your brother on one side, your sister on the other, with the heavy blankets pulled over all of you together. There's no privacy in this arrangement, no personal space. Those concepts are luxuries that the cold doesn't permit. The collective blanket is so heavy that it feels like weight pressing down on you, but this pressure is welcome, part of the insulation strategy. The fewer gaps in the covering, the less heat escapes. Your father performs the same action he performs every night before sleep. He offers a quiet prayer to the protective deities of the house and mountain, words spoken in a low murmur that you can barely hear. Your mother adds her own prayer, and then the fire is banked for the night, not extinguished, because starting a fire from scratch in the morning requires too much effort, but reduced to glowing embers that will need careful tending at first light. Now comes the strange, difficult process of trying to sleep at altitude in extreme cold. You settle into the platform, feeling your brother's shoulder against yours, your sister's breath near your face. The wrapped stones at your feet provide a small island of warmth that you're intensely aware of, knowing it will fade. You can feel your own body heat beginning to accumulate under the blankets, slowly, slowly, as the wool traps air and your metabolism works overtime to generate warmth in the thin oxygen environment. But sleep doesn't come easily at this altitude, even when you're exhausted from a day of labor. The thin air affects everything, including the brain's ability to regulate sleep cycles. You drift into a light doze, then wake suddenly, your heart racing slightly, feeling as though you need to take a deep breath but can't quite fill your lungs. This is periodic breathing, a phenomenon common at high altitude, where your breathing becomes irregular during sleep, sometimes pausing for long seconds before resuming with several deep breaths. It's not dangerous. Your body knows what it's doing, even if your conscious mind finds it alarming. But it fragments your rest into shallow cycles. You'll sleep, but not deeply, not continuously. The cold presses in from every direction that isn't protected by another body or the heavy blankets. Your nose, exposed to the air, feels frozen. Your breath creates small pockets of moisture near your face that chill immediately. If you shift positions, you encounter cold zones in the bedding that haven't been warmed yet, and you quickly shift back to where your body heat has already done its work. The warmth you've created is precious. You don't waste it by moving unnecessarily. You can hear your family breathing around you, the same irregular patterns, the same light snores and sudden deeper breaths. You can hear the wind outside, constant, pushing against the walls, finding the gaps around the door, and making a low whistle that becomes part of the background of every night. Sometimes you hear the yaks shifting in their enclosure, or the distant sound of a dog barking in another part of the village. Once, you hear what might be a snow leopard calling from the high rocks, though it's far enough away that it's just a thin sound carried on the wind. Your mind drifts in the strange, half-awake state that passes for sleep at altitude. You're aware of your body's discomfort, the itch of the wool blankets, the slow ache in your fingers and toes despite the layers, the dryness in your throat and nose. But you're also aware of memory and dream blending together, images of the day's work mixing with older memories, with stories you've been told, with the strange, vivid quality that dreams take on in thin air. Colors seem brighter in high-altitude dreams, events more symbolic, emotions more intense, even as your body remains still and cold. You dream of work, of leading yaks up mountain paths, of hauling water from the frozen stream, of your hands moving through the motions of daily survival. These aren't exciting dreams, but they're persistent. Your mind processing the repetition that defines your existence. You wake again, hours later, though you can't tell exactly how many. The darkness is complete. There are no windows in this room, and the fire has burned down to almost nothing. You hear your father moving carefully, adding a small amount of fuel to the embers, coaxing them back to dim life. The faint glow illuminates nothing, but you know he's there, performing this middle-of-the-night duty that keeps the morning fire possible. The cold has deepened. You can feel it in the quality of the air, in the way your breath seems to freeze the moment it leaves your mouth. The stones at your feet have long since gone cold, and your toes feel distant, almost numb, despite the layers. You flex them carefully inside your boots, working to maintain circulation without disturbing the warmth you've built up around the rest of your body. This is the deepest part of the night, the hours before dawn, when the cold reaches its peak and sleep is most elusive. You lie still, conserving energy, letting time pass in that patient way that mountain people learn, not fighting against discomfort, just enduring it, breath by breath. You think about summer, briefly, when the stone walls warm slightly during the day, and sleep comes easier. But summer is months away, and this thought provides no warmth, so you let it go. You think about the elders in the village, some of whom no longer wake up on mornings after the coldest nights, their hearts simply stopping in the darkness. This is accepted, expected even. The mountain takes what it takes, and all you can do is wake up grateful when dawn comes. You drift again into that shallow sleep, and this time the dream's a stranger. You're walking through snow that reaches your chest, but you're warm, impossibly warm, and the sun is bright overhead, even though you know it's night. You see figures in the distance, ancestors perhaps, or spirits, or just the mind's creation from thin air and exhaustion. They're walking upward, always upward, and you follow because that's what you do here. You climb, you endure, you keep moving even when rest seems impossible. When you wake next, there's the faintest change in the darkness. Not light exactly, but a subtle shift, that suggests dawn is approaching. Your father is already moving, his silhouette barely visible as he works with the fire, adding more fuel, blowing gently on the embers, coaxing flame back into existence. The fire catches, small at first, then growing, and suddenly the room has definition again. You can see the black walls, the hanging storage bags, the smoke beginning its daily accumulation in the upper reaches of the room. Your mother stirs, then your siblings, all of you emerging from the collective warmth of the blankets into the shock of cold air. This transition is brutal. The temperature difference between under the blankets and the room air might be 30 degrees Celsius or more. You move quickly, not removing layers, but adding your outer working clothes, preparing to face the day's tasks. Your fingers are stiff, your joints resistant to movement after hours of cold stillness. Outside, the village is awakening slowly. You can hear similar stirrings from neighboring homes, the sounds of fires being rebuilt, animals being tended, the daily patterns resuming after the long pause of night. The sky is lightening now, turning from black to deep blue, and the peaks around you begin to emerge from darkness, massive and indifferent. The wind has died down slightly, which is a mercy. Some mornings it howls without pause, making even simple tasks dangerous. You step out to break ice on the water vessel, to check the animals, to begin the cycle that will end 12 or 14 hours from now with another descent into cold darkness and fragmented sleep. This is the rhythm of your days, the pattern of your life. There's no complaint in this observation, no self-pity. This is simply what it means to be alive here, at this altitude, in this time. You sleep because you must, poorly because you must, and you wake because somehow, despite everything, the body finds a way to endure. The night has passed, as all nights pass, and you're still here, still breathing the thin air, still facing another day of small struggles and quiet persistence. This is what survival looks like at the roof of the world, not glorious, not comfortable, just continuous, one cold night after another, stretching across years and generations. And tonight, when darkness falls again, you'll repeat this entire process, because that's what you've always done, what your parents did, what their parents did, back through time until the beginning of your people's presence in these valleys. The mountain doesn't change, the cold doesn't relent, and so you simply adapt, endure, and in your own way, persist. Let us drift now from the collective experience of Sherpa nights to follow one particular person through his early years, when the patterns of cold sleep and high-altitude endurance were being written into his very bones. His name was Tenzing Norgay, though that name would change and evolve over time, and he would eventually become known across the world for standing on the highest point of Earth. But that moment of fame, that singular achievement, came much later. And it's not where our interest rests tonight. Instead, we're going to explore the quieter years, the formation of a person who learned to sleep in impossible cold because he had no other choice, who developed the capacity for endurance not through training programs or conscious effort, but simply by living day after day in an environment that demanded endurance from everyone. The year of his birth is uncertain. Records weren't carefully kept in these remote valleys, and exact dates mattered less than seasons and cycles. It was probably 1914, possibly a year or two earlier or later, in a place called Chechu in the Khumbu region, or perhaps in Tem, a village slightly to the west. Even this geographical uncertainty is part of the story, part of the way mountain life existed in soft boundaries rather than precise lines. His family moved, as many families did, following seasonal opportunities, trading routes, the availability of grazing land for animals. What matters is not the exact location, but the quality of that location, high, cold, defined by stone houses and thin air, and the constant presence of mountains that dominated every horizon. He was born into a world where sleep meant cold, where rest was always incomplete, where the body learned from infancy to function with less oxygen than human bodies evolved to require. His family occupied a modest place in the social structure of their village. They weren't wealthy traders or monastic officials, but neither were they the very poorest. They had some yaks, some land, enough to survive, but not enough to be comfortable. His father worked hard, as all fathers did, managing the animals, maintaining the fields, trading when possible. His mother ran the household, as all mothers did, managing food stores, preparing meals, keeping the family alive through careful resource management and constant labor. There were many children in the family, as was common, many births, and also some deaths, because childhood in the Himalayas was precarious even in the best circumstances. Tenzing wasn't the oldest, which meant he grew up following the patterns set by older siblings, learning by watching, by imitating, by slowly taking on responsibilities as he proved capable. His earliest memories, if we could access them, would probably not be of specific events but of sensations, the feeling of cold, the smell of yak-dung smoke, the taste of butter tea, the sound of wind against stone walls at night. These were the constants, the background against which everything else occurred. He would have learned to sleep the way all children learn to sleep there, pressed against siblings for warmth, under heavy blankets, waking frequently in the night to the sound of breathing and wind, never quite comfortable, but never expecting comfort. Sleep wasn't refreshment, it was simply the state between days of work. The house itself was a living thing in its own way, breathing with the family, contracting in the cold, expanding slightly in whatever warmth could be generated. The walls were thick stone, mortared with mud that had been mixed and applied by many hands over many years, patched and repatched as weather wore away the joints. The single room that served as living space, sleeping space, and workspace was dark even during the day, with only small windows that let in minimal light but also minimal cold. The floor was packed earth, worn smooth by generations of feet, covered in places with woven mats that provided slight insulation from the ground's deep chill. In one corner stood the altar, modest but carefully maintained, with its butter lamps and offering bowls and images of protective deities. The smoke from yak-dung fires had blackened the ceiling over decades, creating a layer of soot that actually helped insulate the space, though no one thought of it in those terms. It was simply what happened when you burned fuel for warmth year after year. The sleeping platform occupied most of one wall, raised slightly above the floor to escape the worst of the cold that settled at ground level. This platform was the center of night life, where the entire family arranged themselves in a configuration that balanced warmth distribution with available space, children in the middle where it was warmest, adults on the edges where they could rise more easily if needed. As he grew, his responsibilities increased in the methodical way that childhood responsibilities increased for everyone. First, small tasks around the house, fetching water, helping with the animals, collecting fuel for the fire. These weren't occasional chores but daily necessities, and failure to complete them meant the entire family suffered. There was no concept of childhood as a protected time separate from the serious business of survival. Children were necessary workers, and the sooner they became competent, the better for everyone. Water had to be fetched from the stream or spring, carried in heavy vessels that grew heavier with each step back to the house. In winter, this meant breaking ice first, sometimes chipping away at frozen surfaces with stones until water flowed, hands going numb in the process, then warming them against your body as you carried the load home. The yaks required constant attention. They needed to be moved to different grazing areas, protected from predators, milked when appropriate, their dung collected for fuel. These animals were wealth and survival combined, and losing even one to accident or illness was a serious blow to the family's prospects. Fuel collection was endless work, a task that consumed hours of each day. Yak-dung had to be gathered from the fields and pastures, formed into cakes, dried in whatever sun was available, then stored carefully for the months when no drying would be possible. Wood was scarce at these altitudes, with only stunted shrubs and occasional twisted trees available, each piece carefully cut and carried home. The fire was never allowed to go completely out if it could be avoided. Restarting it was difficult and consumed precious resources, so someone was always responsible for maintaining at least embers, feeding them periodically through the night. He would have spent nights in the same configuration we've already explored: the family sleeping platform, the collective blankets, the fragmented rest that comes with altitude. But children adapt more easily than adults to these conditions, and for him, this was simply normal. His body was learning at a cellular level to produce more red blood cells, to extract oxygen more efficiently from thin air, to function in an environment that would leave lowlanders gasping and dizzy. This wasn't a conscious skill, it was biological adaptation, the body responding to its circumstances across years of exposure. The adaptation happened in ways both visible and invisible. His chest developed the characteristic barrel shape of high-altitude dwellers, expanding to hold lungs that worked harder with each breath. His cardiovascular system reorganized itself, heart and blood vessels changing to move oxygen-poor blood more efficiently. Even his metabolism shifted, learning to extract maximum energy from the limited food available, learning to function during the long fasting periods that characterized winter life. The cold, too, was shaping him. His circulatory system was learning to maintain core temperature, even when extremities went numb, to prioritize vital organs over fingers and toes, to function in conditions that would send most humans into hypothermic crisis. During winter, there were nights when going outside, even briefly, meant pain, when breath froze instantly, when exposed skin could develop frostbite in minutes. He learned to respect this cold, to prepare for it, to move efficiently, to minimize exposure. He learned the subtle signs of serious cold danger, the way fingers stopped hurting when frostbite began, the drowsiness that came with hypothermia, the importance of keeping moving even when exhaustion suggested rest. These lessons weren't taught in words but absorbed through observation, through watching how adults prepared for exposure, through the occasional tragedy when someone misjudged the cold's power. The village where he spent these years was connected to the wider world only by narrow paths that wound through mountain passes, paths that became impassable for months during winter when snow blocked the high routes. This seasonal isolation was complete. When winter came, the village turned inward, relying entirely on stored food, preserved fuel, and the resources immediately available. Those winters were when sleep became most difficult, when the cold reached its deepest, when food supplies dwindled, and everyone went to bed slightly hungry, conserving calories, making the stores last until spring. Hungry sleep in extreme cold is particularly challenging. The body needs energy to generate heat, and without adequate food, that heat is harder to produce. The hunger of late winter was a constant companion, not the acute hunger of starvation, but the chronic undernourishment of rationing, the way meals became smaller and less frequent as stores depleted. The body adapted to this too, learning to function on less, slowing metabolism, conserving energy, but the cost was felt in the cold nights when there wasn't enough internal fuel to maintain comfortable warmth. Sleep during these periods became lighter, more frequently interrupted, as the body struggled to balance its competing needs. Dreams took on a food-focused quality, with elaborate feasts appearing to the sleeping mind, only to vanish upon waking to the reality of thin porridge or weak tea. Tenzing would have known these winters intimately, would have experienced the way hunger sharpened the cold, made sleep even more elusive, turned morning waking into a slow, painful process of forcing stiff limbs to move. There were no heroics in this, just quiet suffering, shared by everyone, accepted as part of the annual cycle. The spring arrival was almost religious in its significance, not just because of renewed warmth, but because of renewed food. The first fresh vegetables, the return of trade routes allowing new supplies, the animals beginning to produce more milk. These marked the transition from endurance to relative abundance, from surviving to actually living. The change wasn't sudden, but gradual, a slow thawing that matched the snow's retreat from the high passes. Sleep improved incrementally as food became more available, as the desperate edge of winter hunger faded, as bodies rebuilt the reserves depleted by months of cold scarcity. The spiritual dimension of his upbringing was inseparable from daily life. His family, like most Sherpa families, practiced Tibetan Buddhism with its emphasis on compassion, impermanence, and the interconnection of all things. The village had a small monastery, or at least a shrine, and throughout the year there were rituals, festivals, ceremonies that marked the passing of time and reinforced community bonds. Before sleep, there were prayers, brief, practiced, woven into the evening routine as naturally as banking the fire. These prayers weren't elaborate or lengthy, but they served a purpose beyond the spiritual. They created a rhythm to the evening, a psychological boundary between day and night, a moment to acknowledge forces beyond human control. The mountain spirits, the protective deities, the vast, indifferent power of the natural world. The prayers were often whispered in the darkness, simple mantras repeated with practiced ease, the words themselves less important than the act of saying them. They created a sonic boundary in the night, a human sound imposed briefly on the vast silence of mountains and cold. For a child growing up in this environment, these prayers would have been as ordinary as breathing, part of the texture of existence rather than something separate or special. The spiritual and practical weren't divided. You prayed for protection, and you also packed stones around the door to keep out wind, and both actions made sense within the same framework of survival. The festivals punctuated the year, providing structure to time that might otherwise blur into undifferentiated seasons. These celebrations involved the entire community, with special foods prepared despite scarcity, with music and dancing despite exhaustion, with moments of genuine joy carved out of a life that offered few such moments. During festivals, sleep patterns changed. People stayed awake later, gathered together in ways that weren't possible during normal work routines, shared stories and songs that carried the accumulated knowledge and humor of generations. These were the nights when the burden of survival lifted slightly, when being human meant more than just enduring, when the cold and altitude and constant work faded into background while community came forward. As Tenzing moved into his teenage years, the weight of expectation increased. He was no longer a child to be protected, but a young man who needed to contribute substantially to the family's survival and eventually establish his own household. This transition brought new pressures and new awareness of the limitations of his family's economic situation. They had enough to survive, but not enough to provide the kind of life that might be more comfortable, that might involve less hardship, less constant cold, less uncertainty about the future. He began to hear stories of the world beyond the immediate valleys, stories from traders who crossed the Tibetan border, from the occasional official who passed through, from rumors and half-understood fragments of news about the larger world. There was a place called India, to the south, vast and warm, where snow was rare and food abundant. These stories painted a picture of a world almost unimaginable to someone who had known only mountain life, a world where cold wasn't constant, where food grew easily, where the air was thick enough to breathe without effort. The stories had the quality of fairy tales, too wonderful to be entirely believable, yet told with enough concrete detail to suggest some truth behind the fantasy. There were strange foreigners who came to attempt climbing the great peaks, people with unusual equipment and peculiar motivations who paid for porters and guides to help them move through the mountains. These expeditions were curiosities, but they also represented possibility, a way to earn money to see beyond the narrow circuit of village life. The foreigners themselves were fascinating and strange, pale people who turned red in the sun, who spoke incomprehensible languages, who seemed both wealthy and helpless, able to afford elaborate equipment, but unable to function in the mountains without Sherpa assistance. They came with maps and instruments, with plans and ambitions, with a driving need to reach summits that held no practical value. To the villagers, this obsession with climbing was puzzling, but also useful. If foreigners wanted to pay money to suffer at high altitude, well, Sherpas had a lifetime of experience in exactly that kind of suffering. The work of carrying loads for expeditions was hard, but it wasn't harder than the ordinary work of village life, and it paid in actual currency rather than mere survival. Tenzing began to nurture a quiet ambition, not clearly formed at first, just a vague sense that there might be something else, some other way of living than the endless cycle of cold nights and subsistence farming. This wasn't rejection of his culture or family, it was the understandable desire of a young person to find a path that might offer slightly more than what he'd known. His opportunity came, as it came for many young Sherpa men, through work as a porter. Expeditions needed people to carry loads to help establish camps to endure the cold and altitude that stopped most outsiders cold. For Sherpas, this work was challenging but not extraordinary. They were simply applying their lifelong adaptation to altitude and cold to earn wages. For Tenzing, it meant leaving home for periods of time, traveling to places like Darjeeling, where expeditions organized, sleeping in different configurations under different conditions. The journey to Darjeeling itself was an education, a descent from the familiar high world into realms where air grew thicker, where vegetation became lush, where the temperature rose to levels that felt almost oppressive after a lifetime of cold. The transition wasn't entirely comfortable. His body, adapted to altitude, struggled slightly with the excess oxygen, and the warmth that should have felt pleasant instead felt heavy and strange. Darjeeling was overwhelming in its density, more people in one place than he had seen in his entire life, buildings stacked together, sounds and smells and constant activity. The expedition organizing happened in this chaos, with climbers arriving from Europe, equipment being unpacked and checked, porters being hired and organized into teams. Those early expedition nights were their own kind of education. The tents were thin, designed for portability rather than warmth, and they offered nothing like the collective heat of a family sleeping platform. He slept in clothes layered much as he'd always layered them, but now the blankets were different, lighter, less effective, issued by expedition organizers who didn't fully understand the cold. Sometimes he shared a tent with other porters, and they huddled together just as families did, sharing body heat because there was no other choice. The tents were made of canvas, treated with wax or rubber for water resistance, but offering little insulation. They flapped constantly in mountain winds, the fabric cracking and snapping with a sound that made sleep even more difficult than usual. Condensation formed on the inside from breathing, freezing into frost that would shower down when anyone moved, adding another layer of cold discomfort to already miserable conditions. The tent floors were often just ground sheets, thin barriers between sleeper and frozen ground, providing almost no insulation from the earth's deep cold. Other times, he slept in camps at extreme altitude, places where even Sherpa adaptation was tested, where the air was so thin that every movement required conscious effort, and sleep became an even more fragmented, difficult process than usual. He would lie awake listening to other porters breathing irregularly, hearing the periodic pauses and sudden gasps that marked high-altitude sleep. At these extreme camps above 20,000 feet, the body's struggle became more apparent. Periodic breathing was common, the rhythm of respiration becoming irregular, with pauses that could last alarming seconds before the body suddenly gasped for air. This pattern was disturbing to listen to, made worse by knowing that your own breathing followed the same irregular pattern, that everyone in the tent was collectively struggling for adequate oxygen. Headaches were constant at these altitudes, a dull pressure that never quite went away, made worse by dehydration and cold. The cold at these camps was fierce, penetrating, worse than most village nights because they were more exposed, on ridges or glaciers with no stone walls for protection, no thick roof of soot-sealed stones, no fire through the night. The morning often brought frost inside the tent, coating sleeping bags with ice formed from exhaled breath. Waking at these high camps was a brutal process. The cold had stiffened everything, sleeping bags frozen into rigid shapes, boots turned into blocks of ice that needed to be thawed before they could be worn, fingers too numb to manage simple tasks like lacing or buckling. The first moments out of the sleeping bag were the worst, when the body's carefully hoarded warmth was lost to the ambient cold, when every movement required conscious willpower. Getting dressed at extreme altitude while cold and oxygen-deprived was an ordeal that could take an hour, each simple action, pulling on a sock, buttoning a jacket, requiring rest breaks and conscious effort. He learned that he could endure this, that his childhood had prepared him for exactly these conditions, that what seemed impossible to the foreigners was merely difficult for him. This wasn't pride exactly, more an observation, a realization that his entire life had been training for this kind of work, even though no one had intended it as such. The contrast between his capabilities and those of the foreign climbers was stark and educational. He watched men who were considered strong in their home countries struggle with loads that Sherpa porters carried routinely. He saw climbers become dizzy and sick at altitudes where he felt merely uncomfortable. He observed the elaborate preparations they needed for cold that he had lived with every day of his life. Between expeditions, he returned home, slept again in the familiar configuration of family and stone house, found himself caught between two worlds, the traditional patterns of village life and the pull of something larger, something that might offer opportunity even as it carried risks. The tension wasn't dramatic, but it was persistent, a quiet discomfort that accompanied him even into sleep. He was aware that leaving for work meant leaving his family with one less pair of hands for the daily labor. He was aware that the money he earned was crucial, but also that it came at a cost to the traditional structure of village life. The money itself was strange, metal coins and paper notes that represented value but couldn't be eaten or burned for warmth, that only had meaning in the context of trade and markets. In the village, wealth meant animals and land, things with direct utility, while in the expedition world, wealth was this abstract currency that could be exchanged for anything or nothing depending on context. He sent money home when he could, watching it transform into things his family needed, food supplies to supplement their stores, repairs to the house, perhaps new clothing or tools. This tangible improvement in family circumstances justified the work, made the cold nights in thin tents worthwhile, gave purpose to the discomfort. And he was aware increasingly that he was good at the work of high-altitude carrying, that he had an unusual capacity for functioning in extreme conditions, that what made him ordinary in his village made him extraordinary in the context of mountaineering expeditions. This awareness would shape the rest of his life, but in these early years it was just beginning to form, just starting to suggest possibilities he couldn't yet fully imagine. His reputation was growing quietly among the expedition community. Climbers remembered porters who performed well, who could be trusted with difficult carries, who remained functional when others struggled. Names were passed between expeditions, recommendations and warnings, assessments of who was reliable and capable. Tenzing's name began to appear in these conversations, noted as someone worth hiring, someone who could handle high-altitude work without complaint or failure. His nights during this period were split between two kinds of cold, the familiar cold of home, with its established patterns and family warmth, and the newer cold of expedition camps, lonely and harsh and filled with foreign sounds. Both taught him, both shaped him, both contributed to the deep well of endurance that would eventually carry him to the top of the world. But that achievement was still years away, still unimaginable in its specifics, even as it was being prepared for in every cold night, every fragmented sleep, every morning of waking with stiff fingers in thin air and forcing the body to move, to work, to continue. The mountain was teaching him, patiently, relentlessly, the way it had taught generations before him, through repetition, through discomfort, through the simple fact of continuing to exist in an environment that didn't care whether he survived or not. His dreams during this time, when he could remember them, mixed the two worlds. He dreamed of carrying impossible loads up paths that never ended, of sleeping in places that shifted between tent and home, of cold that was both familiar and strange. The dreams had the vivid, symbolic quality common at altitude, where the brain, struggling with limited oxygen, creates unusually intense imagery. Sometimes he dreamed of warmth, of places he'd never been, drawn from stories and imagination rather than memory. These were pleasant dreams, but also unsettling, because waking from them into the cold reality of a mountain morning felt like a small betrayal, a reminder of what he didn't have. More often, though, his dreams were simply extensions of daily life, carrying, climbing, managing animals, the repetitive motions that defined existence at altitude. Even in sleep, his mind rehearsed survival, processing the endless small decisions that kept a person alive in an environment of constant challenge. The dreams sometimes took on prophetic qualities, not in any mystical sense, but in the way the unconscious mind processed patterns and possibilities. He dreamed of routes before he walked them, of weather changes before they arrived, of the weight and balance of loads before he lifted them. These weren't supernatural visions, but the natural result of accumulated experience being processed during sleep, the brain organizing information and preparing for future challenges. The fact that some dreams seemed to predict reality was merely evidence of how deeply he understood the mountain environment, how thoroughly his experience had trained his intuition. As the years passed and he took on more expedition work, the balance shifted gradually away from village life and toward a new identity as a high-altitude worker. His body continued to adapt, building on the foundation laid in childhood, developing an extraordinary capacity for functioning in thin air and brutal cold. His ability to sleep in these conditions, or rather his ability to rest adequately despite poor sleep, became part of his professional value. Expedition leaders noticed that while European climbers struggled through miserable nights and woke exhausted, the Sherpas like Tenzing seemed to manage, to remain functional, to keep working day after day, even when sleep was minimal and conditions extreme. What they didn't fully understand was that this wasn't superhuman ability, but simply normal human adaptation applied across a lifetime. Tenzing slept poorly at high altitude, just as everyone did, but he'd been sleeping poorly his entire life, and his body and mind had learned to function anyway. The fragmentation of sleep wasn't shocking to him. It was just how sleep worked. The cold wasn't an enemy to be defeated, but a constant companion to be managed. The thin air wasn't an obstacle, but simply air, the only kind he'd ever really known. He developed strategies without consciously developing them, small habits that maximized rest quality even when quantity was limited. He knew how to position his body to minimize cold exposure, how to use available materials for insulation, how to relax into the discomfort rather than fighting it. He understood that worrying about not sleeping only made sleep more elusive, that acceptance of the situation was more productive than frustration. These weren't lessons from books or instructors, but organic knowledge gained through thousands of difficult nights. This gradual transition from village farmer to mountain worker happened without clear boundaries, without dramatic moments of decision. It was more like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance, shaped by circumstances and available opportunities. He carried his village nights with him into every expedition camp, carried the memory of sleeping pressed against siblings, of heated stones at his feet, of his mother's quiet prayers before the fire was banked. These memories didn't provide warmth, but they provided context, a framework for understanding that what he was experiencing now was hard but not unprecedented, cold but not unique. The connection to home remained strong even as time away increased. He thought of his family during the quiet moments of expeditions, wondered about the progress of seasons in the village, imagined the familiar routines continuing without him. The bond wasn't weakened by distance, but rather sharpened by it, made more consciously appreciated through absence. Home became both a real place to which he would return and an idealized memory that sustained him through difficult periods. In the quiet hours of expedition nights, when other porters were sleeping or trying to sleep, he sometimes thought about the progression of his life, about how the nights of his childhood had led, step by step, to these nights on the flanks of the world's highest mountains. There was a logic to it, a thread connecting the stone house in Khumbu to the canvas tent on Everest, and that thread was simply endurance, learning to continue night after night through cold and discomfort and inadequate rest. He didn't think of himself as special during these reflections. Everyone he knew had the same capacity. Every person in his village could have done what he was doing if circumstances had led them this direction. What set him apart wasn't exceptional ability, but simply the particular path his life had taken, the specific opportunities that had come his way, the choices he'd made to leave home and seek work in an emerging industry that needed people who could sleep at altitudes where most humans couldn't survive. The foundation of everything, though, was those early years, those countless cold nights of childhood and youth, when his body and mind learned the fundamental lessons that no training program could teach: how to rest without comfort, how to sleep without warmth, how to wake and work and continue when every physical signal suggested stopping. The expedition work brought him into contact with different climbing cultures, different approaches to the mountains. British expeditions operated with military precision, hierarchical structures, elaborate planning. German and Austrian climbers brought different sensibilities, often more aggressive in their climbing style, more willing to take risks. Americans, when they came, had their own distinct approach, more individualistic, less bound by tradition. He learned to adapt to these different styles, to understand what each expedition leader valued, to provide the kind of support that would be most useful. This flexibility became another skill, another form of adaptation, not physical this time, but social and professional, the ability to read people and situations and adjust accordingly. The mountains themselves taught him with a consistency that transcended cultural differences. Wind taught the same lessons regardless of who was experiencing it. Cold demanded the same respect from everyone. Altitude imposed the same limitations on all human bodies. The mountain was the ultimate instructor, impartial and relentless, and every night spent at high altitude was another lesson in what it meant to be human in an environment that barely tolerated human presence. These lessons accumulated layer upon layer, building a depth of experience that would prove invaluable in years to come. The physical toll of this work was real and cumulative. Each expedition left him slightly more worn, slightly more marked by the damage that high altitude inevitably inflicts. Frostbite scars accumulated on fingers and toes, small losses of tissue that wouldn't regenerate. His lungs bore the invisible burden of breathing thin, cold air year after year, developing the chronic issues that plague high-altitude workers. Yet he continued, driven by necessity and by the growing sense that this work, difficult as it was, represented opportunity in a world where opportunities for people like him were scarce. The cold nights were the price paid for a chance at something more than subsistence farming, for the possibility of a future different from the past. Between expeditions during the off-season months, life slowed to a different rhythm. These were times for recovery, for reconnection with family and village, for participating in the agricultural work that still anchored Sherpa life, even as expedition work became more prominent. The sleep during these periods was different, longer, deeper, more restorative. His body used these interludes to repair accumulated damage, to rebuild reserves depleted by months of extreme exertion. Yet, even during these quieter times, his dreams remained populated by mountains, by endless carries, by cold camps and thin air. The work had become part of his identity in ways that couldn't be set aside even during rest. The village itself was changing slowly but noticeably as expedition work brought money and foreign influence into the region. Traditional patterns persisted but were modified by new possibilities: purchased goods supplementing local production, occasional Western clothing appearing alongside traditional dress, fragments of English and other languages mixing with Sherpa speech. He was part of this change, one of the agents through which the outside world entered the isolated valleys. This role was complex. He brought opportunities but also disruption, money but also new dependencies, exposure to wider possibilities but also awareness of what the village lacked. The other porters he worked with became a second community, a fellowship of shared experience that transcended individual villages. They understood each other in ways that outsiders couldn't, shared knowledge and strategies, looked out for each other in the dangerous work of high-altitude carrying. These relationships were built through nights spent pressed together in inadequate tents, through mornings of mutual assistance, getting frozen boots on frozen feet, through the unstated but deeply felt bond of people who regularly risked death for modest wages. The trust developed in these circumstances ran deep, based not on words but on repeated proof of reliability under extreme conditions. His understanding of the mountains deepened with each expedition, each night spent at altitude adding to his accumulated knowledge. He learned to read weather in subtle signs, the quality of light, the behavior of clouds, the feel of wind, skills that made the difference between safe decisions and fatal ones. He learned the mountains' moods, the way certain peaks seemed to resist climbers while others permitted ascent, patterns that might be attributed to objective dangers, or might be something less tangible, a quality that resisted scientific explanation but demanded respect nonetheless. This knowledge wasn't mystical but deeply practical, the kind of understanding that comes from paying attention over years of constant exposure. The nights at extreme altitude taught him about his own limits in ways that ordinary life never could. He discovered reservoirs of endurance he hadn't known existed, found he could continue functioning long after he thought exhaustion had claimed him completely. He also learned the signs of genuine limit, the point where continued effort became dangerous rather than heroic, where wisdom meant stopping rather than pushing forward. This discrimination between temporary discomfort and actual danger was perhaps the most valuable skill of all, the thing that kept experienced mountain workers alive while eager but ignorant climbers perished. The cold became an intimate companion, something he understood in ways that went beyond conscious knowledge. His body knew cold, knew its progressive stages, knew the threshold between manageable discomfort and serious danger. This knowledge was written into his nerves and blood, into the automatic responses his body made to falling temperature, into the unconscious adjustments of metabolism and circulation that preserved core function even as extremities suffered. Every cold night had contributed to this education. Every morning of cold awakening had reinforced the lessons. As his reputation grew and he was selected for more prestigious expeditions, the stakes increased, but the fundamental experience remained the same. Whether carrying loads for a small reconnaissance or participating in a major summit attempt, the nights were always cold, sleep was always difficult, morning always brought the same challenge of forcing exhausted body to move. The difference wasn't in the conditions but in the significance attributed to them, the way certain expeditions attracted attention and resources while others passed unnoticed. He learned that the mountain didn't care about these human distinctions, that cold and altitude imposed themselves with democratic indifference on famous climbers and anonymous porters alike. The accumulation of experience became its own form of wealth, less tangible than the money he earned, but perhaps more valuable. He carried in his body and mind a comprehensive education in what it meant to be human at the edge of the possible, in the zones where life barely holds. This education had no formal curriculum, no certificates or diplomas, but it was rigorous and thorough in ways that conventional education rarely achieves. Every lesson was tested immediately and completely, with consequences that couldn't be deferred or avoided. The nights continued, each one adding to the total, each one another data point in the extended experiment of his life. Some nights were worse than others, those at extreme altitude, those during storms, those when injury or illness added to the baseline misery of cold and thin air. Some nights were marginally better, lower camps with slightly thicker air, calm weather reducing wind chill, exhaustion so complete that sleep came despite the discomfort. But all of them shared the essential quality of endurance, of continuing through conditions that weren't designed for human habitation, of extracting rest from circumstances that offered little. His story, at this point in his life, was still unfolding, still ambiguous in its direction. He was becoming known in the small world of Himalayan mountaineering, developing a reputation for reliability and strength, but the great achievement that would make his name familiar worldwide was still years away. What he had now was preparation, thorough, comprehensive, written into his bones and blood through years of living and sleeping in the cold. This preparation would prove essential when opportunity came, when the chance arrived to attempt something that required every ounce of accumulated endurance and skill, but that moment remained in the future, invisible from this vantage point, and what filled his present were these nights, these cold awakenings, these mornings of forcing movement from stiff muscles and numb fingers, these days of carrying heavy loads up steep paths, these evenings of another tent pitched on another exposed ridge, another night of fragmented sleep in thin air and bitter cold. The pattern continued, relentless and formative, shaping him into someone who could accomplish what most considered impossible, preparing him through simple repetition for challenges he couldn't yet imagine. The mountain was patient in its instruction, willing to repeat the same lessons night after night, year after year, until they were thoroughly absorbed. And he was proving to be a dedicated student, through conscious intention, but through the simple fact of continuing to show up, continuing to endure, continuing to sleep and wake and work in an environment that remained fundamentally hostile to human life, night after cold, night after cold night. As night deepens and we move further into this quiet exploration, let us drift away from individual lives and toward the broader mysteries that surrounded sleep in Sherpa culture. There were dimensions to mountain rest that went beyond the purely physical, layers of meaning and experience that make the simple act of closing one's eyes into something more complex, more woven into the fabric of spiritual and community life. The Sherpas and other Himalayan peoples didn't view night simply as an absence of day, a blank space between periods of activity. Night had its own quality, its own presence, and sleep was understood as a time when the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds became permeable, when protective attention was necessary, when dreams carried meanings that daylight thoughts did not. This understanding shaped how homes were constructed, how evening rituals unfolded, and how people interpreted the strange experiences that came with sleeping at extreme altitude. Let us explore these quieter mysteries, these questions without firm answers, these spaces where archaeology, anthropology, and lived experience blur together into something harder to categorize, but deeply fascinating. Consider first the architecture itself, the way sleeping spaces were designed, with more than practical considerations in mind. We've already explored the physical structure, thick stone walls, small doors, sleeping platforms raised off the ground, but there was also a spiritual geography to these rooms. The placement of the hearth wasn't arbitrary, it occupied a central, sacred position, and its maintenance was ritualized. The fire represented continuity, warmth, life itself, and letting it die completely was seen as deeply inauspicious, potentially inviting harmful influences into the home. Around the sleeping areas, families placed protective objects, small carved stones with sacred syllables, strips of cloth printed with prayers, images of deities or high lamas. These weren't decorative, they were functional in a spiritual sense, creating a boundary of protection around vulnerable sleeping bodies. The understanding was that during sleep, consciousness loosened its grip on the body, and in that loosening, negative forces could potentially enter. Spirits of illness, negative energy from the wild mountain spaces, the restless attention of entities that dwelled in uninhabited places. Protection, therefore, was layered, physical walls and spiritual boundaries working together. Some homes had small shrines in the room where the family slept, with butter lamps that were kept lit through the night when resources permitted. The flickering light served multiple purposes. It provided a small amount of warmth, a psychological comfort in the darkness, and a continuous offering to protective deities who watched over the household. The light also helped orient anyone waking, disoriented in the night, a small anchor point in the complete darkness. At altitude, where sleep is fragmented and consciousness drifts between waking and dreaming states, this orientation mattered more than it might seem. The positioning of these protective elements within a room followed patterns that were neither random nor rigidly prescribed, but rather emerged from centuries of collective understanding about how space should be organized. Corners were considered particularly vulnerable, places where negative energies might accumulate or linger, and so protective symbols were often placed near these angular junctures where walls met. The threshold itself, the doorway through which one entered and exited, was understood as a critical boundary requiring its own forms of protection, often marked with painted symbols or blessed objects that guarded against unwanted intrusions. Windows, when they existed at all in these high-altitude dwellings, were small and positioned deliberately, not just to conserve heat, but also to limit the pathways through which harmful influences might enter during the vulnerable night hours. Some families would hang prayer flags or blessed cloth across windows before sleep, creating an additional barrier that operated on a spiritual rather than physical level. These practices reflected a worldview in which the night landscape outside was not empty, but populated, filled with presences that required acknowledgement and appropriate boundaries. The very stones used in construction were sometimes selected with considerations beyond mere structural integrity. Certain rocks, particularly those with unusual colors or patterns, were believed to carry protective qualities, and builders would deliberately incorporate them into walls near sleeping areas. The knowledge of which stones held which properties was passed down through generations of builders, part of an oral tradition that merged practical construction knowledge with spiritual understanding. Now let us turn to one of the most intriguing aspects of high-altitude sleep, the nature of dreams themselves. Sherpas, along with other people who live permanently above 10,000 feet, have long reported that dreams at altitude are different in quality from dreams at lower elevations. They're often more vivid, with colors that seem impossibly bright, details that remain clear even after waking. They're more symbolic, filled with images that carry weight and meaning, climbing endless staircases, encountering animals that speak, seeing deceased relatives who offer cryptic guidance. Modern sleep science has found biological reasons for this phenomenon. At altitude, the brain receives less oxygen, and this affects the way it processes information during sleep, potentially leading to more intense dream imagery and better dream recall. The periodic breathing that occurs during high-altitude sleep, those moments when breathing pauses and then resumes, creates fluctuations in oxygen levels that may contribute to unusual dream states. In the moments of reduced oxygen, the brain may generate more vivid imagery as it struggles to maintain normal function. But for the Sherpas, these scientific explanations would have meant nothing, and their own interpretations held equal validity within their framework of understanding. Vivid dreams were messages, warnings, guidance from the spiritual realm that became more accessible at high altitudes, where the physical world itself seemed less substantial. A dream of a snow leopard might indicate the presence of a protective spirit or a warning of danger. A dream of flying, common at altitude, might suggest spiritual progress or the need to transcend current limitations. Deceased family members appearing in dreams were understood not as mere memories, but as actual visits, the dead taking advantage of the permeable boundary that sleep at altitude created. These visits required interpretation, discussion with family members or sometimes with religious specialists who understood the symbolic language of the dream world. There were also dreams that everyone recognized as warnings, dreams of falling, of being unable to breathe, of wandering lost in snow without shelter. These weren't interpreted symbolically, but as messages from the body itself, signals that something was wrong, that altitude sickness or cold injury was developing. The relationship between physical distress and dream imagery was understood implicitly, even without medical vocabulary to describe it. A person who dreamed of suffocation might be developing high-altitude pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs that interfered with breathing. Someone who dreamed of their extremities freezing might already be suffering from frostbite, the nerves sending distress signals that manifested in dream form. The community's collective experience had taught people to pay attention to these messages, to take action upon waking if certain dream themes appeared. The interpretation of dreams was not a casual matter, but involved careful attention to detail and context, with certain individuals in the community recognized as having particular insight into dream meanings. These interpreters, often elders or those with spiritual training, would be consulted when dreams seemed especially significant or troubling. The conversation around dream interpretation reinforced community bonds, creating opportunities for discussion about fears, hopes, and the mysterious workings of both the physical body and the spiritual realm. Dreams were sometimes shared communally, particularly when they seemed to carry messages relevant to the entire village rather than just the individual dreamer. A dream about an impending storm or avalanche, about the location of a lost animal, or about the proper timing for a journey might be discussed among neighbors and incorporated into collective decision-making. This sharing of dream knowledge created a kind of distributed awareness where the nighttime experiences of many individuals contributed to a larger pool of wisdom that guided group behavior. Children were taught from an early age to remember and report their dreams, to recognize which types of dreams required immediate attention and which was simply the mind's normal processing of daily experience. This training in dream awareness created a population highly attuned to the subtle signals their bodies and minds provided during sleep. The ability to navigate dream symbolism became a survival skill, as practical in its own way as knowing how to read weather signs or track animals across snow. There was also the phenomenon that modern climbers call altitude hallucinations, not quite dreams, but waking visions that occur in the twilight state between sleep and full consciousness. People reported seeing figures in the darkness, hearing voices, feeling presences that couldn't be accounted for by physical reality. Sherpas generally didn't dismiss these experiences as mere hallucinations, products of oxygen-deprived brains creating false perceptions. Instead, they understood them as encounters with the actual spirits and entities that inhabited the mountain realm. The mountain itself was viewed as alive in a sense, populated by beings that existed outside normal human perception, and the reduced consciousness that came with altitude sleep simply allowed glimpses of what was always there. Whether these beings were helpful or harmful varied. Some were protective, guardians of the mountains who looked favorably on people who showed proper respect. Others were neutral, simply present, not particularly interested in human affairs. And some were potentially dangerous, entities that might lead travelers astray, cause sickness, or create misfortune if not properly propitiated. This understanding informed how people behaved around sleep. The prayers offered, the protective objects placed, the careful maintenance of respectful attitudes toward the mountain environment. Sleep wasn't a time of vulnerability only in the physical sense. It was also spiritually vulnerable, requiring conscious attention to protection and propriety. The boundary between hallucination and genuine spiritual encounter was not something that occupied Sherpa thought in the way it might occupy Western scientific thinking. The question of whether an experience was real, in an objective sense, was less important than the question of what the experience meant and what response it required. If you saw a figure in the darkness and felt compelled to offer a prayer or make an offering, then you did so, regardless of whether the figure was a spirit, a hallucination, or some combination that defied easy categorization. This pragmatic approach to unusual perceptual experiences meant that people at altitude developed a kind of psychological flexibility, an ability to navigate states of consciousness that were neither fully awake nor fully asleep without becoming distressed. The acceptance that strange experiences were normal at high altitude created a cultural framework that prevented the fear and anxiety that might otherwise accompany such perceptions. Instead of fighting against these experiences or becoming frightened by them, people learned to flow with them, to treat them as information rather than threats. Let us shift now to what archaeology can tell us about how ancient peoples in these regions manage sleep, though we must acknowledge up front that the archaeological record is frustratingly incomplete. Stone structures survive, but the organic materials that would tell us most about sleeping arrangements, blankets, mats, clothing, decay rapidly in the harsh mountain environment. What remains are the bones of houses, the patterns of hearths, the placement of walls and platforms. Archaeologists working in high-altitude sites have found remarkably consistent patterns across centuries. Sleeping platforms raised off the ground, central hearths, thick walls oriented to minimize wind exposure. The excavation of these ancient hearths reveals layers upon layers of ash and soot, each layer representing countless fires, countless nights of families gathering around warmth before dispersing to their cold sleep. The chemical analysis of this soot can tell us what was burned: yak-dung primarily, but also juniper when available, along with traces of incense materials used in evening rituals. Around these hearths, archaeologists sometimes find small ritual objects, carved stones, fragments of butter lamps, pieces of prayer flags. These objects speak to the spiritual dimension of evening life, confirming that the practices observed in more recent times have deep historical roots. In some excavated sites, particularly those that were seasonally occupied, the sleeping platforms show interesting variations in construction. Some were built with hollow spaces underneath, areas that might have been filled with dried grass or other insulating materials, creating an air gap between the cold ground and the sleeping surface. This suggests a sophisticated understanding of heat retention principles, knowledge developed through generations of experimentation and observation. The people who built these structures weren't primitive in their approach. They were highly adapted specialists in surviving extreme environments. The archaeological record also reveals patterns of continuity and gradual innovation in how sleeping spaces were constructed over time. Early structures show simpler designs, while later ones incorporate refinements that suggest accumulated knowledge about what worked best. The thickness of walls gradually increased in certain regions, the height of sleeping platforms was adjusted, and the positioning of hearths evolved to maximize heat distribution while minimizing smoke accumulation. These changes happened slowly across generations, each improvement representing countless nights of lived experience that revealed what could be done better. Some sites show evidence of experimental construction techniques that were apparently tried and then abandoned, suggesting that not all innovations proved successful. Sleeping platforms at unusual heights, hearth designs that didn't draw properly, wall configurations that created problematic air currents. These failed experiments left their traces, reminding us that the successful sleeping arrangements we see in later periods were hard-won through trial and error. The people who developed these techniques paid a price in cold nights and poor sleep as they worked out what functioned and what didn't. One of the most mysterious aspects of high-altitude archaeology concerns temporary camps, seasonal shelters that were used during migrations between valleys or during summer grazing seasons when herders moved to higher pastures with their animals. These camps left minimal traces, sometimes just circles of stones that once anchored tent walls, sometimes small rock enclosures that provided wind protection. Archaeological evidence suggests these camps were used repeatedly over long periods, with the same sites chosen again and again, presumably because they offered specific advantages: protection from wind, proximity to water sources, good views of surrounding terrain for security. But almost nothing survives to tell us exactly how people slept in these exposed locations. We can infer from later practices and from the logic of survival that they would have huddled together, used every available animal skin and woven blanket, built small fires that were carefully tended through the night. But the specific details are lost, leaving us with tantalizing gaps in the story. There's something almost poetic about this absence. The countless nights that humans spent in these high places, the millions of hours of cold sleep and fragmented rest, have left barely a trace. The experience was real, was lived intensely by real people, but it has faded into silence, leaving only stones and ash as testimony. Some sites show evidence of deliberate abandonment, with ritual deposits left behind, offerings placed in hearths before they were finally allowed to go cold, objects buried at thresholds. These suggest that leaving a home, even temporarily, required spiritual acknowledgement, a recognition that the space had been important, that the nights spent there mattered. The ritual aspects of abandoning a sleeping space reveal something profound about the relationship between people and the places where they slept. These weren't just functional shelters, but spaces that had been inhabited by consciousness during its most vulnerable hours, spaces where dreams had been dreamed, where children had been born and elders had died, where countless intimate moments had unfolded in darkness. To simply walk away from such a space without acknowledgement would have felt wrong, a violation of the relationship between people and place that had developed over years or generations. The offerings left in abandoned hearths were typically simple: butter, barley flour, perhaps a prayer scarf or a small carved stone. These items were meant to thank the protective forces that had watched over the household during their residence, and to ensure that the space would remain auspicious for whoever might use it next. The act of making these offerings transformed abandonment into a proper leave-taking, a closing of one chapter that left the space open for new chapters to begin. Now let us consider the social and cultural dimensions of sleep. The way that nighttime rest functioned as community practice rather than individual experience. We've already explored how families slept together out of practical necessity, but this physical closeness had broader implications for social structure and emotional life. Privacy, as understood in modern Western contexts, essentially didn't exist. Everyone knew how everyone else slept, knew who snored, who had nightmares, who thrashed in their sleep, who lay still. This intimate knowledge created a different kind of social bond, You knew people's vulnerabilities, their unconscious selves, in ways that daytime interaction never revealed. Children grew up understanding that their parents were also just bodies, also struggled with cold and discomfort, also faced the same challenges everyone faced. This lack of privacy extended to sounds as well. In the deep silence of mountain nights, sounds carried between homes. You could hear neighbors coughing, hear their conversations before sleep, hear children crying or being soothed. The village at night was a network of sounds, each household contributing to a collective acoustic environment. This created a sense of mutual awareness, of being part of something larger than individual families. If sounds suddenly stopped from a neighboring home on a cold night, people noticed, and in the morning someone would check, making sure illness or accident hadn't struck. This informal system of acoustic monitoring helped protect vulnerable individuals, the elderly, the sick, anyone who might need help during the night. The collective nature of sleep also influenced emotional development. Children learned early that their discomfort wasn't unique, that everyone struggled with cold and poor rest, that endurance was shared rather than individual. This probably contributed to the emotional resilience that Sherpas were noted for, the ability to accept hardship without complaint, to maintain equanimity in difficult conditions. If everyone you knew faced the same challenges, those challenges became normal rather than exceptional. The sounds of the village at night created a kind of acoustic map that residents learned to read with great subtlety. You could identify specific families by the patterns of coughing, the particular pitch of a child's cry, the rhythm of movement within a household as people settled for sleep. This knowledge was not consciously sought, but absorbed naturally through years of listening, becoming part of the intuitive awareness that guided community life. When unusual sounds broke the normal nighttime pattern, this acoustic awareness allowed for rapid response. A sudden cry of distress, the sounds of an argument escalating beyond normal bounds, the peculiar silence that might indicate someone had collapsed or fallen. These disruptions registered immediately with those who heard them, and appropriate help could be summoned or offered. The thin walls and the carrying quality of sound in mountain air meant that no household was truly isolated, that help was always potentially available if urgently needed. There were also interesting gender dimensions to sleeping arrangements. In most households, women and men slept in the same spaces, with children interspersed. But there were subtle hierarchies of position: who slept closest to the fire's residual warmth, who got the slightly better blankets, who occupied the more protected positions on the sleeping platform. Generally, children and elders received the best positions, while adults in their prime took the more exposed locations. This wasn't enforced by rule, but emerged from shared understanding of who was most vulnerable to cold. However, there were exceptions based on who did the most physically demanding work. A father who would rise before dawn to undertake a long journey might receive better sleeping position the night before, storing up whatever rest was possible. A mother who had recently given birth would be given the warmest spot, surrounded by family members whose body heat helped her recovery. These adjustments happened fluidly through wordless negotiation and shared concern for collective survival. In winter, when food was scarce and cold most intense, sleeping arrangements sometimes expanded beyond individual families. Extended kin might consolidate into fewer houses, leaving some structures empty in order to concentrate body heat and resources more efficiently. This winter consolidation was temporary and understood by all as practical rather than social commentary. When spring came and conditions eased, families would return to their own homes, but the memory of those shared winter nights reinforced bonds between related households. The negotiations around sleeping positions, though often wordless, were complex social interactions that revealed much about family dynamics and values. Children observed these negotiations and learned the unspoken rules that governed communal living: how to assess another person's needs, how to offer sacrifice without making it seem like martyrdom, how to accept help without losing dignity. These lessons, learned in the intimate context of preparing for sleep, shaped social behavior that extended far beyond the sleeping platform into all aspects of community life. There were also seasonal variations in these arrangements that reflected changing conditions and needs. In autumn, during harvest season, when everyone was exhausted from long days of work, the sleeping arrangements prioritized recovery, with those who had worked hardest receiving the best positions. In spring, when supplies were lowest and energy was needed for planting and renewal, pregnant women and nursing mothers received priority, ensuring the continuation of the community into the next generation. The evenings before sleep were also times for storytelling, one of the most important cultural practices in Sherpa society. In the long hours after the final meal and before sleep, families would tell stories, myths, legends, tales of ancestors, accounts of strange events and unusual encounters. These stories served multiple purposes. They educated children about proper behavior, reinforced cultural values, provided entertainment during dark hours, and helped ease the transition towards sleep. The rhythm of storytelling, the calm voice, the familiar narrative patterns, the soft repetition of tales everyone had heard before, created a soothing atmosphere that made the prospect of cold sleep slightly less daunting. Many stories were deliberately told in ways that induced drowsiness, with circular structures and repetitive phrases that acted almost like verbal lullabies. There were specific stories designated for winter nights, tales that acknowledged the hardship of the season while also providing reassurance that spring would eventually return, that the cold wasn't permanent, that endurance had meaning and purpose. These seasonal stories helped place current suffering into a larger temporal framework. Other stories dealt directly with sleep and dreams, tales of people who dreamed the future, who encountered spirits in their sleep and received warnings or blessings, who traveled in dream states to distant places and returned with knowledge. These stories validated the importance of dream life and reinforced the cultural understanding that sleep was more than mere unconsciousness. The art of storytelling itself was a skill passed down through generations, with certain individuals recognized as particularly gifted narrators whose stories could hold attention more effectively and create more powerful emotional responses. These skilled storytellers understood pacing, knew how to modulate their voices to match the emotional content of the tale, knew when to pause for effect and when to rush forward to maintain tension. Their performances in the hours before sleep were anticipated events, particularly during the long, dark winter months when entertainment options were limited. Stories also functioned as containers for cultural memory, preserving knowledge about the landscape, about past events, about lessons learned through sometimes tragic experience. A story about a traveler who ignored warning signs and perished in a storm carried practical information about reading weather, about the dangers of overconfidence, about the importance of respecting the mountain environment. Children who heard such stories absorbed this knowledge without it being presented as formal instruction, learning through narrative what they needed to survive in their harsh world. Some families also practiced evening prayers collectively, not just the brief individual prayers we mentioned earlier, but longer sessions where mantras were recited, protective visualizations performed, and requests made to various deities for safe passage through the night. These practices created acoustic and temporal boundaries, marking the transition from day to night, from activity to rest. The use of butter lamps during these evening rituals served both practical and symbolic purposes. The warm light flickered across stone walls, creating dancing shadows that were familiar and comforting. The smell of burning butter, sometimes mixed with incense, became psychologically associated with evening and sleep, creating an olfactory trigger that helped the mind transition toward rest. Even in the coldest, most difficult nights, these familiar sensory cues provided a small measure of comfort. The collective prayers often followed established patterns with responses and repetitions that everyone in the household knew by heart. This participation in something larger than oneself, this joining of voices in a shared spiritual practice, created a sense of security and connection that helped counter the isolation and vulnerability that darkness and cold might otherwise bring. For children, the sound of adult voices reciting familiar prayers was deeply reassuring, a signal that the world remained ordered and comprehensible despite the mystery and danger that night represented. The timing of these prayers was not arbitrary but aligned with the natural rhythms of the household's evening routine. They came after the last tasks were completed, after the door was secured, after everyone had arranged themselves in their sleeping positions. This timing created a clear demarcation between the active day and the vulnerable night, giving everyone time to psychologically prepare for the transition into sleep. Let us also consider the enigmatic role of sound in preparing for sleep. In a place where silence was often profound, the sounds that did exist took on amplified importance. The wind, always present, created a sonic backdrop that people learned to read. Its pitch and intensity carried information about weather conditions, about whether the night would worsen or stabilize. Experienced listeners could distinguish between different types of wind and predict what the next hours would bring. The sounds of animals settling for the night, yaks shifting in their enclosure, dogs adjusting their positions, the occasional bleat or grunt, these sounds were reassuring, indicators that the protective perimeter around the household remained intact. Silence from the animals would be concerning, suggesting something was wrong. Within the house, the sounds of the fire, the pop and hiss of burning dung, the occasional louder crack as a piece of fuel shifted, these sounds marked the presence of warmth and life. When the fire was banked for the night and these sounds diminished, their absence itself became part of the nighttime soundscape. And then there were the human sounds, breathing, snoring, the rustle of blankets, the occasional murmur from someone dreaming or shifting position. These sounds created an acoustic cocoon, a reminder that you weren't alone in the darkness and cold. For children especially, the sound of parents breathing nearby was deeply comforting, a reassurance that adults were present and maintaining the vigilance that kept everyone safe. This acoustic presence was perhaps as important as physical warmth in making sleep possible. The development of this acoustic literacy began in infancy and continued throughout life, becoming increasingly sophisticated with age and experience. Young children learned first to distinguish familiar sounds from unfamiliar ones, to know the difference between their own family's nighttime rhythms and those of neighbors. As they grew, they learned to interpret more subtle variations, the way wind sounded different when it carried moisture versus when the air was dry, the particular quality of animal sounds that indicated contentment versus distress. Adults developed the ability to sleep through familiar sounds while remaining alert to unusual ones, a kind of selective attention that allowed rest while maintaining necessary vigilance. This ability was crucial for survival, ensuring that genuine threats, the approach of predators, the sound of falling rocks, the particular quality of wind that preceded an avalanche, would register even during sleep and trigger immediate waking. There's a mystery here that archaeology and anthropology can document but never fully explain. How exactly did consciousness adapt to these conditions across generations? What psychological mechanisms developed to allow people to accept fragmented, uncomfortable sleep as normal? How did the human mind learn to extract adequate rest from inadequate conditions night after night, year after year, across entire lifetimes? The answers exist somewhere in the intersection of biology, culture, and individual adaptation, but they remain partially obscure, part of the larger mystery of human resilience. We know that it happened. The evidence is irrefutable in the form of thriving communities that existed for centuries at altitudes where sleep should theoretically be impossible. But knowing that it happened is different from fully understanding how it felt, what it cost, what compensations and adjustments occurred at levels too subtle to be captured in historical records or archaeological data. Perhaps the most we can say is that human beings are extraordinarily adaptive, that consciousness itself is more flexible than we usually recognize, and that what seems impossible from the outside becomes simply normal when it's the only reality available. The Sherpas didn't think of their sleep as heroic or extraordinary. It was just sleep, just what you did when darkness fell and cold deepened. The adaptation to altitude sleep likely involved changes at multiple levels: physiological adjustments in how the body processed oxygen, neurological adaptations in sleep architecture, psychological shifts in expectations and attitudes toward rest, and cultural frameworks that supported these adaptations through ritual, story, and shared practice. Each of these levels influenced the others, creating a complex system of mutual reinforcement that made sustainable life at altitude possible. Consider the physiological dimension. Over generations, bodies adapted to function more efficiently in low-oxygen environments, developing larger lung capacities, more efficient oxygen transport systems, and metabolic processes better suited to altitude conditions. These adaptations didn't happen consciously or quickly, but emerged through the slow process of natural selection, with those individuals better suited to altitude having slightly better survival and reproductive success. At the neurological level, the brain's sleep regulation systems must have adapted as well, learning to consolidate rest more efficiently during fragmented sleep periods, to prioritize the most essential types of sleep when full normal sleep cycles weren't possible, to extract more recovery value from less optimal conditions. Again, these adaptations happened beneath conscious awareness, the result of countless nights of pressure, selecting for systems that functioned adequately under challenging circumstances. The psychological adaptations were perhaps more rapid and more influenced by cultural transmission than purely biological factors. Children raised in these environments learned expectations about sleep from their earliest experiences, never developing the assumption that sleep should be comfortable, uninterrupted, or easy. Their baseline for normal rest was established in conditions that would seem intolerable to someone from a lower altitude, and so they never experienced their sleep as deficient or problematic. The cultural frameworks that supported these adaptations were crucial and often underappreciated in discussions of high-altitude survival. The stories told about sleep, the rituals performed around rest, the collective understanding that everyone faced the same challenges, these created a psychological container that made difficult conditions bearable. When your entire community validates that sleep at altitude is difficult for everyone, that fragmented rest is normal, that what you're experiencing is shared rather than unique, the psychological burden of poor sleep diminishes significantly. There were also practical coping strategies embedded in cultural knowledge and transmitted through observation and instruction. The understanding that certain sleeping positions helped with breathing, that particular breathing patterns could be consciously adopted when waking with air hunger, that movement and position changes during the night were normal and acceptable rather than signs of restlessness. This knowledge helped people navigate altitude sleep more effectively. The timing of sleep also adapted to altitude conditions in ways that might not be immediately obvious. Rather than expecting continuous 8-hour sleep periods, the cultural norm recognized that rest at altitude would be fragmented, with multiple wakings and periods of semi-consciousness throughout the night. This recognition removed the anxiety that might otherwise accompany such fragmentation, allowing people to drift back to sleep after waking rather than lying awake, frustrated by their inability to maintain continuous rest. Daytime napping, when circumstances and workload permitted, was recognized as a legitimate form of rest rather than a sign of laziness or weakness. This flexibility in when and how sleep occurred allowed people to accumulate adequate rest across a full day-night cycle, even when nighttime sleep alone was insufficient. The cultural acceptance of this adaptive sleep pattern removed any stigma that might otherwise have attached to unconventional rest schedules. And in that quiet acceptance, in that lack of drama or self-congratulation, there's something profound about human nature, our capacity to normalize the abnormal, to build functional lives in dysfunctional circumstances, to find small comforts in large hardships, and to pass this knowledge down through generations not as conscious teaching, but as lived experience, absorbed through thousands of cold nights, starting in infancy and continuing across entire lives. The transmission of this knowledge happened through what anthropologists might call embodied learning. Knowledge gained not through explicit instruction, but through physical experience repeated until it becomes automatic and unconscious. A child sleeping, pressed against their mother's back, learned through their body how to arrange themselves for maximum warmth, how to match breathing rhythms with another person, how to shift position without fully waking, how to distinguish serious discomfort that required action from minor discomfort that could be ignored. This embodied knowledge extended to countless small skills and awarenesses that supported nighttime survival. Knowing by feel in complete darkness where blankets and extra clothing were stored, being able to bank a fire by touch alone, understanding how to move carefully in a crowded sleeping space without disturbing others, recognizing by subtle sensory cues whether the cold was becoming dangerous or remained tolerable. None of these skills were taught formally, yet everyone who grew up in these environments possessed them, acquired through years of lived practice. The intergenerational transmission also included emotional modeling. Children observed how adults responded to difficult nights, how they maintained equanimity in the face of discomfort, how they supported one another without complaint or expectation of praise. This modeling shaped emotional responses to hardship, creating patterns of resilience that operated at a deep psychological level, beneath conscious thought or deliberate effort. There was also wisdom transmitted about when to endure and when to act, when poor sleep was simply an inevitable part of altitude life, and when it signaled genuine danger requiring response. This discernment was crucial and subtle, requiring attention to multiple signals from body, environment, and the behavior of others. Someone sleeping fitfully but regularly was probably just experiencing normal altitude sleep. Someone whose breathing became increasingly labored or who seemed unable to wake fully was potentially developing a life-threatening condition requiring immediate attention. The collective nature of sleeping arrangements meant that this monitoring happened communally rather than individually. Multiple people would notice if someone's condition seemed to be deteriorating, and the decision about whether intervention was needed emerged from shared observation rather than individual judgment. This distributed vigilance made nighttime survival more robust, less dependent on any single person's awareness or expertise. As we reach toward the conclusion of this exploration, we find ourselves confronting the essential mystery that remains at the heart of all discussions of high-altitude sleep: the sheer improbability that it works at all. By every reasonable measure, sustained life at these altitudes should be impossible, the combination of cold and oxygen deprivation too severe for the human organism to manage long-term. Yet it happened, and continues to happen, not as a temporary emergency measure, but as normal life sustained across generations. The archaeological record, fragmentary though it is, documents human presence at extreme altitudes extending back thousands of years, suggesting that this improbable adaptation is not recent, but ancient. Somewhere in the deep past, groups of humans moved into these mountain regions and stayed, developing over centuries the biological and cultural adaptations that made permanent residence possible. The reasons for this migration might have been varied: pressure from competing groups in more hospitable lowlands, the attraction of resources available at altitude, spiritual or cultural motivations we can no longer reconstruct. Whatever drew people to these heights, they encountered sleeping conditions that must have seemed impossible to endure long-term. The initial generations probably experienced sleep deprivation of a severity we can barely imagine. Night after night of inadequate rest that would have affected every aspect of functioning. Yet they persisted, and somehow their children adapted slightly better, and their children's children better still, until what had been barely survivable became simply normal. The story of high-altitude sleep is ultimately a story about the remarkable plasticity of human beings, our ability to adapt to extremes that seem to exceed our species' capabilities. It's a story written not in grand narratives or heroic achievements, but in quiet endurance, in the accumulation of countless cold nights accepted without drama or complaint, in the transmission of adaptive knowledge through generations of lived experience rather than formal teaching. It reminds us that human life has been lived in astonishing variety across this planet, that what seems essential to us, comfortable, uninterrupted sleep in warm, safe environments, is a luxury that most humans throughout history have managed without. The Sherpas and other high-altitude peoples developed different relationships with sleep, relationships shaped by necessity, into forms that worked even when they shouldn't have, that sustained life and culture and community even under conditions that seem incompatible with human thriving. As we conclude this exploration, we might reflect on what this history can teach us about resilience, adaptation, and the human capacity to make lives in seemingly impossible places. The answers are not simple or reducible to single explanations, but exist in the complex interaction of biology, culture, environment, and individual experience. What remains clear is that human beings are far more adaptable than we often recognize, that consciousness and culture can shape biology, and that what seems impossible from outside can become simply normal when it's the only life available. As we drift deeper into this evening's exploration, let us now turn our attention to a quieter truth about Sherpa society, that not everyone experienced the cold nights in quite the same way. While the mountain imposed its harsh democracy on all human bodies, demanding adaptation and endurance from everyone, there were nonetheless gradations of comfort, hierarchies of warmth, differences in how the wealthy and the powerful faced the same darkness and cold that challenged everyone else. This isn't a story of extreme wealth versus extreme poverty, not in the way those terms might apply in urban centers or agricultural societies with strong class divisions. The differences were more subtle, more a matter of degrees than absolutes. But they were real, and they mattered deeply to those who experienced them, and they shaped social relationships in ways that persisted even when daylight came and everyone emerged to face similar challenges. Let us explore these gradations with the same calm attention we brought to other aspects of mountain sleep. At the apex of Sherpa social structure stood the monastic community, monks and nuns who had dedicated their lives to religious practice and study, and particularly the high lamas and rinpoches who held positions of spiritual authority. These individuals occupied a unique space in the social landscape, neither wealthy in material terms nor poor, but possessing something perhaps more valuable than wealth, institutional support and collective resources. The monasteries themselves were architectural expressions of accumulated community resources across generations. Built with thicker walls than ordinary homes, often incorporating stone buttressing and multiple stories, with the sleeping quarters on upper levels where heat might rise from lower rooms, these structures represented centuries of refinement in higher altitude architecture. The sleeping quarters for monks were still simple by lowland standards, small cells or shared dormitories, minimal furnishing, no luxuries in any conventional sense. But they were better insulated, more carefully constructed, maintained by communal labor that ensured walls remained sealed and roofs stayed intact. Many monasteries had central assembly halls with large hearths where monks gathered for evening prayers, and this communal warmth could be substantial when dozens of bodies filled a space and fires burned through longer evening sessions. Afterward, monks returned to cold sleeping quarters, but they did so having absorbed warmth that would carry them through at least the early part of the night. The monastic diet, while simple and often sparse, was more reliable than what many families managed. Regular meals meant better ability to generate body heat, and in winter, when some households reduced food consumption to stretch supplies, the monasteries generally maintained more consistent feeding schedules through their collective stores and donations from the community. Some monasteries had access to better blankets, thicker weaves, occasionally supplemented by donations from wealthy patrons, sometimes including textiles that came from trade networks stretching across Tibet and into China. These blankets were institutional property rather than personal possessions, but they provided better insulation than what many individual families could afford. The monks also had something else that influenced sleep quality: reduced physical labor compared to farmers and herders. While monastic life involved its own rigors, long prayer sessions, ritual obligations, study requirements, it didn't include the exhausting physical work of managing animals, hauling water, and maintaining terraced fields in thin air. This meant monks often came to sleep less physically depleted, which helped them achieve slightly better rest despite the cold and altitude. The spiritual practices themselves, meditation techniques, breathing exercises, visualization practices, may have also provided psychological tools for managing discomfort and achieving rest more efficiently. There's archaeological and historical evidence that some larger monasteries developed sophisticated heating strategies. Winter sleeping quarters might be positioned to share walls with kitchens or with spaces where animals were kept, using the heat from these sources to slightly warm the sleeping areas. Some monasteries constructed platforms with hollow spaces beneath them where warm ashes from hearths could be placed before sleep, providing gentle heat that radiated upward through the night. These weren't elaborate heating systems, but they represented considerable ingenuity and collective effort applied to the problem of cold sleep. The spiritual dimension also mattered. Monks slept within buildings that were sanctified spaces, surrounded by sacred objects and centuries of accumulated prayers and rituals. For believers, and virtually everyone in this society was a believer to some degree, this spiritual protection would have provided psychological comfort that eased the transition into sleep. The knowledge that you were sleeping in a protected space, watched over by protective deities and the spiritual force of countless prayers, created a sense of safety that helped counter the anxiety that cold and darkness might otherwise produce. This wasn't superstition separate from practical concerns. It was integrated into the same framework that valued thick walls and good blankets. Below the monastic elite but above the average farmer stood the trading families, households that had accumulated resources through successful participation in the salt and wool trade routes that connected Tibet with the lowlands of Nepal and India. These families weren't nobles in any feudal sense. There was no hereditary aristocracy among the Sherpas, but they were wealthier, and that wealth translated into better sleep conditions. A successful trading family might have a larger house with multiple rooms, allowing them to reserve one space specifically for winter sleeping, a room that could be more carefully sealed and maintained than spaces that served multiple purposes. This specialization allowed for better heat retention and more comfortable sleeping arrangements. They could afford thicker, higher quality blankets, not just yak wool, but finer sheep wool, occasionally even goat wool, from Tibetan sources, woven in denser patterns that trapped heat more effectively. They might have multiple layers of blankets per person, rather than the single, heavy covering that poorer families shared collectively. Their fuel supplies were more generous, larger stores of yak-dung, and sometimes access to dried juniper wood from lower valleys, which burned hotter and with less smoke than dung alone. This meant their evening fires could be larger and last longer, warming the room more thoroughly before sleep and providing more residual heat through the night. The heated stones placed in sleeping areas could be larger and more numerous, and traders' families sometimes had purpose-made stone vessels that retained heat more efficiently than ordinary rocks. These vessels would be heated in the fire and then wrapped in cloth and placed strategically in the sleeping arrangement, providing focused warmth to core areas. Trading families also had better access to imported items, occasionally Chinese or Indian textiles, metal braziers that could hold coals through the night, even rare luxuries like tea of higher quality that provided better nutrition and warmth. Their clothing was likely to be in better condition, replaced more frequently, providing more effective insulation. The social position of these families also meant they could sometimes consolidate relatives into their larger homes during the worst of winter, providing warmth to extended family while also strengthening their own social networks and obligations. This wasn't pure altruism, it was part of the complex web of reciprocal obligations that structured Sherpa society, but it meant that more people slept more comfortably under the protection of wealthy households. Yet we must be careful not to overstate this comfort. Even the wealthiest trader still slept in a stone house at extreme altitude, still faced the same thin air and bitter cold that everyone faced. Their children still woke with frost on their blankets on the coldest mornings, still experienced the fragmented sleep that altitude imposes, still knew what it meant to be cold through the long winter nights. The gradient of comfort was real but modest: more blankets, not heated rooms; better food, not abundance; larger houses, not mansions. Another category deserving attention is the caravan masters and expedition organizers who emerged as commercial mountaineering developed in the early 20th century. These individuals occupied an interesting position, not traditionally elite, but newly wealthy from their roles connecting Sherpa labor with Western expeditions. They often slept in mixed conditions, part of the year in home villages under traditional circumstances, part of the year in expedition camps or in places like Darjeeling, where they organized logistics, and part of the year actually on mountains in the most extreme conditions imaginable. This varied experience gave them unique perspective on the full range of sleeping conditions. When home, they could afford the same improvements that trading families enjoyed: better blankets, more fuel, larger homes. But they also carried with them equipment from expeditions, occasionally a Western-style sleeping bag that found its way into personal possession, canvas tarps that could supplement traditional roofing, metal cookpots that heated more efficiently than clay vessels. These hybrid accommodations reflected their liminal social position, caught between traditional Sherpa culture and the new economy of mountaineering. Their sleep practices similarly blended Western equipment used within traditional stone houses, evening prayers followed by logistical planning for upcoming expeditions. Their children grew up with unusual exposure to different ways of managing mountain cold, seeing both the ancestral methods and the imported technologies, learning to value both approaches. This cross-cultural knowledge would eventually spread more widely through Sherpa communities as mountaineering became more central to the regional economy. The landowners represented another tier of relative comfort: families that controlled the best agricultural land, the most productive barley fields, the prime pastures for yak herding. Land was the traditional form of wealth in Sherpa society, and those who controlled more of it had more reliable food sources and more animals. More animals meant more fuel. Yak-dung was produced in quantities roughly proportional to herd size, so wealthy families with large herds simply had more to burn. It also meant more yak hair for blankets, more butter for both nutrition and lamp fuel, more trading capacity for securing other goods. These families could maintain larger fires, burn them longer into the evening, heat more stones for the sleeping platforms, and generally create warmer environments for sleep. The difference might only be a few degrees Celsius, but at extreme altitude and temperatures, those few degrees could mean the difference between miserable sleep and merely uncomfortable sleep. Their homes were also more likely to be well maintained, repairs performed promptly, walls checked regularly for gaps, roofs kept in good condition. This wasn't simply because they had more resources, though that helped, but because they had more labor available. Extended families and sometimes hired workers contributed to household maintenance, meaning problems could be addressed before they became serious. A gap in a wall that might let cold air stream in through a winter could be sealed immediately rather than endured until spring, because someone was available to do the work. Now let us consider the other end of the spectrum, though we must approach this carefully because even the poorest Sherpa families had community support that prevented absolute destitution. Still, there were households that struggled more than others, that faced harder choices and colder nights. The poorest families, those with little land, few animals, perhaps headed by widows or elderly couples without adult children nearby, faced winters with minimal resources. Their fuel supplies were smaller, carefully rationed, meaning evening fires were modest and banked early to conserve dung for the next day's cooking. Their blankets were fewer and older, wool worn thin in places, patched and repatched, but no longer providing optimal insulation. Their homes might be smaller or in poorer condition, with walls that had developed gaps over time and couldn't be properly repaired due to lack of labor or materials. They ate less, especially in late winter when stores ran lowest, and this reduced their body's ability to generate heat. Their sleep was probably the most fragmented, the most uncomfortable, the least restorative of anyone in the community. Yet even here, we must note that these families weren't abandoned. Sherpa social structure included strong expectations of mutual aid. Wealthier families shared fuel and food, community prayers included requests for protection of the vulnerable, and there was genuine social pressure against allowing anyone to suffer extreme deprivation. The poorest families still slept cold, but not alone in their struggle. Someone would check on them during the hardest weeks, someone would share resources, someone would ensure they survived until conditions improved. This collective safety net reflected Buddhist values of compassion and the practical recognition that in a harsh environment, everyone's survival depended on maintaining community cohesion. The gradient of comfort existed, but it operated within boundaries of minimum acceptable conditions that the community enforced through informal means. Within families, too, there were hierarchies of warmth. The elderly often received the best sleeping positions, closest to where the fire had been, surrounded by others, given the thickest blankets. This respect for age was both cultural value and practical recognition that older bodies generated less heat and were more vulnerable to cold. Similarly, young children were protected, placed in the warmest positions, monitored through the night. Adults in their prime were expected to endure more discomfort, to take the exposed positions, to sacrifice their own comfort for the vulnerable. This wasn't resented but accepted as proper order, the way things should be. Gender patterns were less pronounced than in many societies. Both men and women worked brutally hard, and both faced similar cold at night, though sometimes men working away from home on trading expeditions or early mountaineering work faced even harsher conditions than what families experienced together. Their nights in temporary shelters or expedition camps were often colder and lonelier than anything their wives endured at home. Let us also consider the seasonal dimension of these hierarchies. In summer, when conditions eased and cold was less extreme, the differences between wealthy and poor became less significant. Everyone slept better, everyone faced less hardship, and the gradient of comfort flattened considerably. But winter amplified every advantage and disadvantage. The wealthy families' extra blankets mattered intensely when temperatures dropped below -30. The poor families' thinner walls became unbearable rather than merely uncomfortable. These seasonal fluctuations meant that social hierarchies were perhaps most visible and most consequential during the months when survival was most challenging, which reinforced the importance of community support systems that helped balance these inequalities. One final dimension worth exploring is the question of aspiration and social mobility. Children growing up in poorer families were acutely aware that some of their peers slept warmer, had better food, faced less hardship. This awareness could motivate ambition the desire to improve one's situation through trade, through work with expeditions, through exceptional success in agriculture or animal husbandry. The gradient of comfort, precisely because it was visible but not overwhelming, created aspiration without despair. Young people could realistically imagine achieving better circumstances, and many did through hard work and opportunity. The mountaineering economy, in particular, offered unprecedented chances for social advancement. Skilled climbers and organizers could accumulate wealth that exceeded what traditional paths provided. This social fluidity meant that sleeping arrangements could change across a lifetime. A person might remember cold, difficult childhood nights in a small, drafty house, then experience relative comfort in middle age if their efforts succeeded, then perhaps return to simpler conditions in old age when living with adult children. This arc was understood and accepted. Comfort wasn't permanent, and neither was hardship, and the mountain ultimately leveled everyone eventually, regardless of how many blankets they'd accumulated. In the end, after considering all these gradations of comfort and hierarchies of warmth, we're left with a fundamental truth, that even the most advantaged person in Sherpa society still faced conditions that would seem impossibly harsh to people in gentler climates. The warmest sleeper among the Sherpas still slept colder than most humans have ever experienced. The best fed still ate less than adequate nutrition demanded. The most comfortable still woke repeatedly through the night to the effects of altitude and cold. The gradient existed, but it existed within a range of difficulty that united everyone in shared experience of hardship. The wealthy trader might sleep slightly warmer than the poor farmer, but both knew what it meant to wake with frost on their blankets. Both understood the exhaustion of fragmented altitude sleep. Both had felt the mountain's cold penetrate through whatever layers of protection they could afford. This shared experience, even across economic differences, created a form of social solidarity that might not have existed if the gaps had been wider. Everyone ultimately was at the mountain's mercy, and everyone understood that their comfort depended as much on communal support and collective knowledge as on individual resources. And so the nights passed, winter after winter, generation after generation, with some sleeping slightly warmer than others, but all sleeping cold, all adapting, all learning to rest in conditions that demanded continuous endurance. The variations mattered to individuals, shaped their lives and opportunities, but the fundamental pattern remained constant. Sleep at altitude was hard, and everyone, regardless of status, had to find ways to endure it. We've drifted now through many hours and many centuries, following the thread of sleep from individual experience through biography to mystery, to the quiet inequalities that shaped even the hardest communities. The night has deepened around us, and perhaps you've found yourself sinking into that comfortable space between full awareness and gentle rest, your mind following these stories of cold and endurance while your body relaxes into warmth and safety. Let us take a few moments now to gather these threads together, to reflect quietly on what we've explored, and to consider the strange distance between those mountain nights and the circumstance in which you find yourself right now. The Sherpas learned to sleep in conditions that seem impossible, at altitudes where the air itself feels insufficient, where cold penetrates every barrier, where the body's normal rest cycles are disrupted by the simple fact of being too high above the sea. They did this not through superhuman ability or special biological adaptation beyond what any human body can achieve, but through cultural knowledge accumulated across generations and the simple, unremarkable acceptance of their circumstances. For them, there was no alternative reality to compare against, no easy option that made their nightly struggle seem like an unnecessary hardship. The cold nights were simply what nights were, and sleep was something you learned to manage the way you learned to manage thin air and steep paths and all the other challenges of high-altitude existence. Their adaptations were both practical and profound. The architecture of stone houses designed to trap every possible degree of warmth, the social arrangements that pooled body heat, the spiritual practices that provided psychological comfort alongside physical preparation. They developed knowledge about heated stones and wool blankets, about sleeping positions and breathing patterns, about how to bank a fire so it could be revived at dawn without wasting precious fuel. But beyond these practical skills, they developed something harder to quantify, a mental framework that accepted discomfort without despair, that found ways to rest even when rest was incomplete, that woke each morning and continued despite the knowledge that the next night would bring the same challenges. This psychological adaptation might be more remarkable than any physical tolerance they developed. We followed one particular person, Tenzing Norgay, through his early years to understand how these patterns shaped an individual life. His story reminds us that the famous moment of standing on Everest's summit was built on foundations laid during countless unremarkable nights in cold stone houses, during childhood sleep pressed against siblings, during youth spent learning that the body can endure far more than comfort suggests. His ability to function at extreme altitude wasn't a gift or talent, but simply the natural result of growing up in an environment that demanded such function from everyone. The cold nights of his childhood were his training ground, though no one thought of them that way at the time. We explored the mysteries that surrounded mountain sleep, the vivid dreams that came with thin air, the spiritual dimensions that shaped how people understood nighttime vulnerability, the archaeological traces that speak to centuries of similar struggles. These mysteries remind us that human experience is always richer than purely material explanations can capture, that the physical challenge of sleeping in extreme cold was inseparable from the cultural and spiritual frameworks that gave that challenge meaning. And we examined, with careful attention, how even in the most egalitarian societies facing the most democratically harsh conditions, some people slept warmer than others. The gradients of comfort were modest compared to inequalities in gentler climates, but they were real, and they mattered deeply to those who experienced them. A few extra blankets, a slightly larger fire, better maintained walls, these small advantages could mean the difference between bearable and unbearable nights, between adequate rest and exhausted waking. Yet even the most advantaged Sherpa still faced hardships that united them in experience with the poorest members of their community, creating a shared understanding that transcended economic differences. Now consider for a moment your own circumstances as you listen to these words. You're likely in a space where temperature is controlled, where the air holds adequate oxygen, where blankets are plentiful and walls are sealed against wind. The cold that challenged the Sherpas every single night is something you might experience briefly when stepping outside on a winter day, but you return quickly to warmth, to comfort, to conditions that your body doesn't have to struggle against. Your sleep, when it comes, will be deeper and more continuous than the Sherpas ever experienced, interrupted perhaps by dreams, but not by the body's desperate attempts to extract oxygen from insufficient air. This contrast isn't meant to inspire guilt about your advantages or to suggest that modern comfort is somehow wrong or unearned. It's simply a recognition of how far human circumstances can vary, how adaptable we are as a species, how what seems impossible from one perspective is simply normal from another. The Sherpas didn't think of themselves as suffering extraordinarily. They were just living their lives, doing what needed to be done, sleeping as best they could in the circumstances they inhabited. They found meaning, connection, purpose, and even moments of contentment within conditions that seem brutal from outside. Their lives weren't defined only by hardship. There was also community, family, spiritual depth, the satisfaction of competence in a demanding environment, the beauty of their mountain landscape, the richness of their cultural traditions. The cold nights were part of the larger pattern, challenging but not nullifying the other dimensions of experience. As you settle deeper into your own rest tonight, perhaps you can carry with you some small appreciation for the warmth that surrounds you, for the ease with which your lungs pull in adequate oxygen, for the simple luxury of uninterrupted sleep in a space designed for your comfort. These aren't trivial gifts, they're the result of centuries of human ingenuity in creating shelter and controlling environment, privileges that most of our ancestors, like the Sherpas, never experienced. But perhaps you can also carry something else, a recognition of human resilience, of our species' remarkable capacity to adapt and endure, to find ways forward even in the most challenging circumstances. The Sherpas sleeping in their cold stone houses weren't heroes in their own minds, but their daily endurance across generations represents something profound about human possibility. They proved that consciousness can learn to rest even when the body protests, that communities can develop knowledge systems that allow survival in impossible places, that human warmth, both literal and metaphorical, can persist even when external conditions seem designed to extinguish it. Their nights, repeated millions of times across centuries, represent a quiet triumph of adaptation over adversity. The specific circumstances they faced, the extreme altitude, the bitter cold, the thin air, might seem distant from your own life, and in practical terms they are. But the underlying pattern of finding ways to endure difficulty, of learning to rest despite discomfort, of accepting what can't be changed while working to improve what can. These patterns are more universal, touching lives in every time and place. We all face our own versions of cold nights, our own challenges to adequate rest, our own struggles between the body's needs and the environment's indifference. The Sherpa example, lived at such extreme, can help us recognize and honor the smaller but still real endurances that mark every human life. As the night continues its slow passage toward dawn, as your own breathing deepens and consciousness begins to drift more fully toward sleep, you might let these images fade gently. The stone houses growing dim in your mind, the sounds of wind diminishing, the cold releasing its hold. The Sherpas would be preparing now for another day, banking their fires for another night, continuing the cycles that have defined their existence for so many generations. But you can release these thoughts, let them settle like snow on distant peaks, beautiful and distant, part of history's vast landscape, but not requiring your continued attention. Your own sleep awaits, easier and warmer than theirs ever was, and there's no guilt in accepting that ease. The stone houses will stand without your observation, the mountains will continue their slow dance with cold and wind, the patterns of adaptation and endurance will persist, whether you think of them or not. What remains is simply this, an evening spent in quiet contemplation of how humans have lived, how we've adapted to the most challenging environments, how we've learned to rest even when rest seemed impossible. You've accompanied these people through their nights, felt something of their experience, understood a little more about the breadth of human possibility. And now, having traveled these paths together, having drifted through these cold valleys and thin air and fragmented dreams, you can return to your own warm space, your own adequate oxygen, your own protected sleep. The journey has been quiet, the pace slow, the details many but gently offered, designed to carry you toward rest rather than stimulation. Let your body sink deeper into whatever surface supports you now. Let your breathing find its own rhythm, steady and calm, easier than the irregular breathing of altitude sleep. Let your muscles release whatever tension they've held, knowing that your environment supports rather than challenges you, that your rest tonight will be restorative in ways that Sherpa rest never quite managed to be. Let your mind drift away from specific images and facts, holding only perhaps a soft appreciation for warmth, for ease, for the simple grace of adequate air and comfortable darkness. The Sherpas have taught us what they can teach, not through words they spoke, but through lives they lived, through the accumulated evidence of their endurance, through the patterns their nights etched into the mountain landscape. We've listened carefully, followed their paths with respect and attention, honored their experience by taking it seriously rather than romanticizing or dismissing it. Now that lesson can settle into memory, ready to be recalled if needed, but not demanding continued focus. The night stretches ahead, offering hours of rest that you can accept without struggle, without the challenges that marked every night for those mountain people. Your sleep will be different from theirs, deeper, warmer, more continuous, more restorative. And in that difference lies no betrayal of their memory, but simply the truth that human circumstances vary infinitely, that what one group endured as normal can be extraordinary from another's perspective, that we can honor historical experience without needing to replicate it. So rest now, easily and well, in the warmth that surrounds you and the comfort that supports you. Let these stories of cold mountain nights serve their purpose, not to disturb your peace, but to deepen your appreciation for the peace you possess, not to create guilt, but to create gratitude, not to burden, but to ease your transition into sleep through the gentle fascination of history's quieter corners. The mountains will stand through the night, as they always have. The stone houses will shelter whoever still lives in them, as they've sheltered generations before. The patterns of cold sleep and morning waking will continue in the high valleys where they must, while you, in your gentler climate and easier circumstances, can simply let consciousness fade, breathing slowing, mind quieting, body releasing into the deep rest that every human needs and deserves, but that so few throughout history have been fortunate enough to experience as fully and comfortably as you can tonight. Sleep well then, wherever you are, whatever the hour. Let the stories fade like stars at dawn, present but no longer demanding attention. Let the cold remain distant, the altitude theoretical, the struggle historical rather than immediate. You've traveled far tonight through time and space and human experience, and now you've arrived back at yourself, at this moment, at this place of warmth and safety and approaching rest. The journey is complete. The night can continue without your observation. And sleep, that universal human need that the Sherpas struggled toward, and you can simply accept, awaits with all its gentle promises of restoration and release. May your dreams be peaceful, your rest be deep, and your morning come gently, with none of the harsh awakening that cold mountain dawns demanded from those whose nights we've shared tonight. The past has offered its lessons, the present offers its comfort, and the future can wait until you wake, rested and renewed in your own time and your own warmth, carrying perhaps just the faintest memory of stone houses and thin air, and the quiet endurance of people who learned to sleep where sleep seemed impossible, and who, through their persistence, proved that human life can flourish even in the harshest corners of the world, one cold night at a time, across all the generations that came before, and that will continue long after we ourselves have faded into the same historical distance we've been exploring together through these quiet, drifting hours of darkness.